you, Ashley, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I really enjoy this topic, and so I'm excited to speak about it. I've spoke many presentations over the years to beef producers, but this is the first one on Zoom, and definitely the biggest disadvantage is I can't see you, and it's just really weird speaking and you don't see anybody. I'm just talking to my computer. But it also is the first presentation I've given without wearing shoes. So that's also an advantage, I guess. But I'm going to talk about factors affecting beef carcass value. And I'll preface this talk by saying, if we look at beef cattle traits and divide them into three categories of reproduction, growth, and carcass, in the typical cow-calf operation, the most important of those as far as profitability is reproduction, and the things that Dr. Beard just talked about is probably going to impact bottom line the most. And second most important are growth traits. And the third most important would be the carcass traits. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about them, because as you'll see in my presentation, that carcass value can differ dramatically, and it is important. But it's also important to have the balanced approach and remember about reproduction and cow size and all those things. As we look at beef carcass value, and any meat value or market animal value, there's three main factors that would affect that. The first one being size, and this is probably going to have the biggest effect, because we sell meat, we sell carcasses, we sell animals by the pound. So size will always, will continue to be a very important factor in value. And that's why we still should worry about growth rate and average daily gain and weaning weight and all those things. I'm not going to talk a lot about that in this presentation, but I do want to point out that is a big driver of value. Secondly is quality. So most of my talk will be focused on the mainstream market, where quality is defined by quality grade, prime, choice, select, etc. And that impacts on value. Now, quality will not always be defined by quality grade, and I'll touch on that at the end of my presentation. And quality might be defined differently for you and depending on your market. And the third factor is cutability. How much meat is there in relation to fat? We grade cutability with USDA yield grades, where yield grade number 1 is the highest cutability and yield grade number 5 is the lowest cutability. But cutability is basically how much fat are we going to get how much meat are we going to get compared to fat and bone? And of course that impacts carcass value. So let's talk about quality first. So quality in the US in the mainstream market is primarily driven by quality grade. Quality grade is a function of maturity and marbling, but within the fed, steer, and heifer population, 95% of them cattle are A maturity, and within A maturity, the only determinant to quality grade is marbling. So for most cattle, the thing that's going to determine their quality grade is marbling. Now, quality grades are historically assigned by USDA grader online in packing plants, but in the last 10 years, we've seen most packers shift almost exclusively to instrument grading. As you see here, the typical grading instrument will capture a video image, and the computer will read that image and can measure the ribeye, fat thickness, and marbling in like a split second, and then give you the quality and yield grade. As you see here, this is a choice yield grade 2. So how do the current cattle in the US break down in terms of quality grade? The most recent National Beef Quality Audit was in 2016. This surveyed thousands of carcasses in over 20 packing plants all across the US. And you can see the breakdown here. The most cattle fall in the choice grade. About 2/3 of fed steers and heifers in the US currently grade choice. The next most common would be select. About 1/4 of the animals grading select. About 4% grade prime, 1 out of every 25. And then about 6% grade below select. Now, the way the industry breaks those down, and if you sell cattle on the grid or if you look at meat prices, you'll see these 5 categories. Choice is broken into 2 groups. The bottom third of choice is what we sell as choice, or what we call commodity choice. And then the upper 2/3 of choice usually goes into a branded beef program, like certified Angus beef would be the most common one there. But there's also sterling silver and many other top upper 2/3 choice programs. So we see about 30% of the cattle going into one of those upper 2/3 choice programs, and about 37% are sold as commodity choice. Anything that's below select, which would be standard commercial utility cutter and canner, is sold as no roll or ungraded meat. It's not graded, and the industry term is no roll. Now, if you look, there's USDA reports every day or every week. This is a weekly report, the comprehensive box beef cutout. So this is a report for March 1st, which, a week ago. And this is, what is the value of all the box beef that a packer is selling this week, for each grade. So all of the from an average carcass. So an average carcass, that if you sold it on the box beef market for prime grade, it would be worth $258 a hundredweight, or $2.58 a pound for the carcass value. Compared to choice, which is our base here, is $231. So prime is worth, in today's market, about $27 more than choice per hundredweight, 27 cents more a pound. Branded, which would be your upper 2/3 choice, most of this would be certified Angus beef, is about $8 higher than choice. Select is about $7 below choice, and no roll or ungraded meat is about $27 below choice. So this report is published every week. If you care to look at it, it's online on the Market News website. Another report that's published once a week is the premiums and discounts report. So this is if you're a producer selling to a packer on a grid, this is the average premium and discount paid for that week across the US. So choice is the base, is considered the base. That's whatever the market value is, or whenever you negotiate with the packer. And then prime is the average premium above choice for that week was about $14 premium. The average discount for select that week was about $12, and no roll was $29 discount. CAB cattle, or top choice cattle, a certified Angus beef or top choice cattle, would be about $5 ahead of choice. So this is what the packer is paying the producer, either above or below the market. The previous slide was the actual value to the packer, the true value, where this is what the packer is paying to the producer. And you can see other premiums for natural cattle, non-hormone treated cattle, and discounts for dairy, etc. So what does that mean in terms of real dollars? What is the value of quality grade? So this is a steer that we killed quite a few years ago, but it's good data set to look at. And these are current prices. So this cutout is from this steer. He's just an average steer. He was a choice yield grade 3 steer, just typical steer. So this is, if you look at, this is the weight of his cut. So when we cut up his carcass, this is how he had 27 pounds of ribeye, 41 pounds of shoulder clod. If we multiply that by the current box beef prices, so these box beef prices are from the end of 2020. So these are about 3 or 4 months old, but fairly current prices here. We see that a choice carcass, if he grades choice, which is actually what he graded, his box beef is worth about $1,800 in today's market. If he was in the upper 2/3 choice, that's about $70 more. And if he's prime, his box beef is worth about $2,000. If he's select, $1,725. If he's no roll or standard, he's $1,559. So you can see a large value for this particular steer. By the way, this steer is weighed about 1,400 pounds and about a 900-pound carcass. So you can see on that size of animal, there's about a $500 difference, just depending whether he graded no roll or up to prime. So a big value difference there in quality grade. So switching gears, that was the value of quality we know is big. So what about the value of cutability? Cutability, again, is proportion of muscle in relation to fat and bone. It's how much meat cuts we're going to end up with when we cut up that carcass and trim the fat and the bone out. Cutability can also be called red meat yield, percent boneless trim retail cuts, carcass cutout value, different names, but it means the yield of the actual red meat from the carcass. You can see this carcass on the left is a higher cutability. This is a hind quarter and the front quarter compared to this carcass on the right, which is much lower cutability, hind quarter and the front quarter. So cutability, as I stated, is measured in the US, or carcasses are divided according to USDA yield grades, where yield grade 1 is the highest cutability and yield grade 5 is the lowest cutability. And here you can see the red meat yield as a percentage of hot carcass weight for a yield grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then on the right here is the percent boneless trim retail cuts as a percentage of the carcass. The difference in these two is this one includes the ground beef, and this is just the retail cuts. So, but either way, we see there's, a big cutability difference or cutout yield difference as we go from a yield grade 1 to a yield grade 5, as you can see down here. So how does that affect value? Well, let's look at two steers that we slaughtered a while ago again, but these two steers were weighed about the same. They were both about 1,400 pounds, and actually for this exercise, I adjusted them to be exactly the same so we can compare apples to apples. So which steer, first question is, which steer do you think had resulted in the higher quality carcass in terms of higher quality grade? And you can just answer that in your head. You can type it in the chat, although I can't see the chat at the moment, but you can.
If you get it in the chat, we'll give you a little bit of feedback. You got a 1.
Okay, a 1, all right.
One person's committed.
Okay, one person, all right. So then which of these steers will result in a higher cutability carcass? And you can.
Okay, so right now you're kind of about a 50-50 on 1 and 2. I think you're getting a little higher on 2s.
Okay, well now maybe people are answering 2s to the second question. It's kind of confusing because I asked 2 questions, but you would probably expect number 1 to have higher quality and number 2 to have higher cutability. And that is the case. These are very distinct different steers. Here's their carcasses. Number 1 was a standard, so a no roll, so very low quality, but very high cutability, yield grade 1. And that wasn't number 1, it was number 2 steer, the red steer. We'll call them the red and the black steer. The red steer was a high cutability, but low quality, no roll, yield grade 1. The black steer was a very high quality, graded prime, highest quality grade. Only 4% of carcasses grade that, but he was a very low cutability, yield grade 5. So 2 quite extreme examples. So if we price those steers out using their actual cutout data and today's market, so this is, like I said, the end of 2020. So it's about 3 months old market, but it's not changed a lot since then. We can see that these 2 steers actually come out to a pretty similar price. One is, both have good things about them and bad things about them, and their cutout value comes out somewhat similar. And actually the higher cutability steer in this case comes out about $90 a head. But if you look at individual cuts here, you see the ribeye, which is, a high dollar middle meat cut. The black steer, has a much higher value ribeye because it's priced at a prime. It's a prime ribeye compared to a no roll ribeye. Of course, that's a big difference in price. But if you look at some other cuts, like the top round, for example, there's not much difference in price between prime and no roll. And the red steer had many more pounds of it, even at the same carcass weight. These are coming out at the same, both about 900 pounds. And you can see, of course, a lot of that's difference in fat, which the red steer had 103 pounds of fat and the black steer had 314 pounds of fat. So cutability has a big impact on value. What if we hypothetically make these 2 steers the same quality? If we just want to look at cutability by itself. So here I photoshopped these 2 ribeyes. They now both grade choice. Probably not a very likely thing that would ever happen. But just for hypothetical comparison, if they both were priced at the same value of meat, you now see a difference of $1,400 and $2,000. So about $600 a head difference of that value is due to cutability. And we saw, 500 and some on our quality example. So both cutability and quality can have a large impact on value. So what determined that? Why do these two cattle look the way they do? Why did they result in the carcasses that they resulted in? Why is that one high cutability, that one high marbling? What is that? Well, that's a combination of course, genetics and environment equal phenotype. So let's talk a little bit about genetics and environment and how they impact quality and cutability. So cutability starts first. The genetic component of cutability is really the degree of muscularity. The red steer had more genetic potential for muscle growth, and that's why he ended up with a larger ribeye, larger cuts, but that's also why he ended up with less fat at the same harvest weight. Not necessarily, maybe because he had genetics for less fat, but because he had genetics for more muscle, and therefore the energy went to muscle instead of fat. What about from an environmental standpoint? The main driver there is time on feed. As time on feed increases, muscle growth slows down and fat, and those calories go to fat. So that, of course, is going to affect cutability. So if we look at growth curves of these two steers, if we look at a growth curve here, we see rapid muscle growth, and then somewhere in here is puberty, and that muscle growth starts slowing down. And so muscle is increasing in growth, and then animal reaches puberty and muscle and growth rate slows down and eventually plateaus. And as that slows down and plateaus, those excess calories start becoming fat. Now, this animal had more genetic potential for muscle growth, so therefore he started putting on fat later in his life. He probably reached puberty later in his life, and that's one reason for that difference in influx or in that growth curve. And that's why we kind of call these kind of animals later. We call this kind of breed type later maturing and earlier maturing body types because of that. Now this black steer, at one time he was a yield grade 1. At one time he was really lean, but that was probably back when he weighed 850 pounds. So when we slaughter them both at the same weight, we draw this line in here at 1,400 pounds, we see the big difference in cutability that results from a genetics for muscling and our time on feed. So both quality and cutability affect value. We've established that fact. But the problem is high quality animals are often low cutability, and high cutability animals are often low quality, like we see here. So in other words, there's an antagonism between cutability and quality. According to the most recent National Beef Quality Audit, the average prime carcass in the US has an average yield grade of 3.8. The average choice carcass has an average yield grade of 3.3, and the average select carcass has an average yield grade of 2.7. So the higher the quality, the lower the cutability, and vice versa. And that antagonism exists from both a genetic and an environmental standpoint. For example, genetics, we see that antagonism when we look at breed differences, and we see that antagonism when we look at differences within the breed. Like those breeds that are typically high marbling, more tender, higher quality meat are typically lower muscling and lower cutability. Those breeds that are typically low quality are the ones that are higher muscle and higher cutability. If we look at extreme differences, even less extreme differences, but these photos are the extreme, the super light muscle, but high marbled Jersey. That's also very tender, flavorful meat compared to the limousine that's high cutability, but very low marbling. Most of those differences are related to red and white fiber types, which are something determined by genetics and established at birth and not changeable. So we see there's a strong genetic component. But even within breed, as you can see, these two bulls are different in muscle phenotype, and we see that antagonism exists there as well. What about environment? Time on feed. So, of course, as we get longer time on feed, we get more fat deposition, and that causes marbling to go up. Marbling is this dotted line. And we see percent boneless trim retail cuts go down, which is this solid line. We also see this antagonism with growth promotants. Hormone implants, some of them can increase cutability. They cause nutrients to go to muscle instead of fat, but they can sometimes decrease quality, both in marbling and sometimes tenderness. Beta agonists, which have even a stronger effect, like ractopamine, zilpaterol, which is not allowed in the US anymore, but is in other countries. Those increase muscle and decrease fat, but they can decrease quality. So how do we improve both? We don't want either one of these. We don't want super high quality with low cutability, and we don't want a super high cutability with low quality. How do we have both? Well, the good news is you can have both. It's challenging and not very common, but 1 out of every 22 beef carcasses in the National Beef Quality Audit is a choice yield grade 1. They do exist. 1 out of every 3,300 beef carcasses, pretty rare, but they happen, is a prime yield grade 1. And here's a picture of one right here. So you can have both. How do we do that? One thing, different ways, but one approach is using breed complementarity. We know that continental breeds are usually more muscular, higher cutability, and British breeds are higher marbling. So it's really common practice is to cross those two breed types and result in a continental English cross that can hopefully excel in both. That actual steer right there, which is that smoky steer, a Charolais Angus cross, ended up to be a top upper 2/3 choice yield grade 2. So he's not as high quality as that black steer was, and he's not as high cutability as that red steer, but he's above average in both. And look at his value, same price, same market, today's current market. He's worth $1,956. Remember, those other two steers were worth about $1,600. Same weight. These are all adjusted to a 900-pound carcass, so take weight out of the equation. And this steer is worth $300 more than both of them. We can select within breed, attack the antagonism. If we look at these EPDs here, we look at a few bulls. We see this bull is the highest on ribeye. If we want muscling, let's go with this bull. But he's also the lowest on marbling. Pretty typical of the antagonism. Heavy muscle with low marbling. Look at this bull. Let's go for marbling. We really just go for marbling. Well, then we're going to give up muscling. This bull is below average muscling. High marble but light muscle. But this bull here, he's not the heaviest muscle, he's not the highest marbling, but he's good at both. We can find those outliers, those curve benders, and attack the antagonism. And then market cattle correctly. There's a window that's where you optimize cutability and quality. You don't want to go too short or you'll have low quality. You don't want to go too long or you'll have low cutability. So last thing I want to end on is, what is meat quality? Only thing I've talked about is marbling and quality grade, but that might not be meat quality for you, especially in, I know a lot of people in Arizona are marketing locally, selling into niche markets, brands. So marbling might not be your definition of meat quality, or it may only be a component. But so far, that's what we've talked about, USDA quality grade. But probably, the ideal thing is to define quality as eating quality. Marbling, palatability is tenderness, juiciness, and flavor, determines the customer satisfaction. And, marbling is only a component of that. There's many, many factors. These are all factors that affect eating quality, factors that affect palatability. Marbling is right here. Marbling is only one component of all the things that affect tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. So, if we could focus on true eating quality, but it's hard to measure. That's the problem. Now, maybe Quality is, quality is what the consumer wants. And maybe your consumer wants all natural or no added hormones or no antibiotics or even organic. And that might be quality. Grass-fed or grain-fed might be your quality. Or story beef, consumers, a segment of consumers, a growing segment, wants to know where their beef comes from, who's the people behind it, who raised it, how was it raised, and did they care for it and love it and treat it nicely. All those things can be quality. So quality and all those things can have big effects on value. So it's important that you define quality according to your consumer or who's ever buying your animals. Cutability will always impact value no matter how you define quality, but quality, the definition can change. So with that, I saved some time for questions if there's any questions.
Okay, so Jim, do we have you live here now? Can you speak to us? You had a question, I believe. And
I was going to ask when you were showing the different premiums on the grids, was the NHTC or the all natural, would that be on top of if you also had a prime grade?
That really depends on the program. And so that's program specific. The way they generate that report is they look at the average premium or discount paid by all the different programs. So those NHTCs and all natural, and those are slightly different because it only applies to those programs. So that doesn't necessarily mean that if you produce an NHTC animal today that you're going to get that premium, because you kind of got to be, you got to be lined up to sell to that particular program, or that packer or program has to be looking for that. So the quality grade prices are premiums discounts are more universal across all grids. The NHTC are depending on the program. But to answer your question, typically in most programs, you would get your quality grade premium or discount on top of your NHTC premium.
so I have to say that you've got a complaint from a couple of people, and I kind of agree that you made us hungry with the picture of the burger.
Okay.
Burgers, but we do also have some other questions. What is the ideal to butcher for best quality of meat? What is ideal to butcher for the best quality of meat? I'm not quite sure. So maybe
you have to declare.
So give us a little more clarification. We'll come back to that, Darren's. So we do have another one, and hopefully Darren's will let us know give us a little more info. What are some of the genetic factors to consider in terms of feed efficiency?
Well, there is a big genetic component of feed efficiency, and several breeds now have EPDs, and there's markers, genetic markers available. So, that's been the difficult to measure traits like feed efficiency and carcass traits are some of the first things that the companies went after for genetic markers. So fortunately, they're now available. What are some things that are correlated with that? We know in the feedlot that muscle growth is correlated with feed efficiency because muscle takes a lot less energy to put on a pound of muscle than it does to put on a pound of fat. So if the animal's growing muscle, they're more feed efficient than growing fat. And as that animal matures and starts depositing more and more fat and muscle growth slows down, feed efficiency goes down. But that's probably opposite for the cow though, because muscle is a high maintenance tissue and muscle requires more energy for maintenance than a lighter muscled animal. So it's kind of the opposite. It's the opposite from the cow side.
So if you're building the burger, then that's different from building the calf out in the field. Okay.
Correct.
All
And
right.
there's a lot of things you could do if you were in a terminal system where you raise your females only for female traits, and you use the terminal sire for the feedlot and carcass traits. But for most people, don't have that luxury.
Okay. All right. So Darren's got back to us. What age is ideal to butcher for the great quality meat?
Okay. That's a great question and not a definite answer. Definitely controversy around that answer. The average market age has decreased over the last 40 years as we've made animals grow faster. The average slaughter age today is like 14, 16 months, and it used to be, closer to 20. And so what happens as you go from 14 to 24, is, marbling will go up. Marbling is related to age. So an older animal will have more marbling at the same amount of fat. That's one reason for backgrounding, growing animals slow early in their life, is they'll get fat at a later age, and therefore they'll have more marbling. Tenderness will decrease a little bit as animals get older. I mean, it's kind of a linear thing. So from 14 to 24 months, there will be some tenderness decrease, although it probably will not be huge. Flavor will go up. Some of the best ground beef is from those 3 or 4 year olds. They have more flavor than young market cattle. But so it kind of depends on your market, or if you're selling your own beef and you want to have something different, or if you're trying to get it to market as fast as you can and you just want it to grade.
Okay. So a couple of other questions we got. Do salt blocks make a difference?
Boy, I haven't done any research or read anything on that. So I mean, certainly deficiencies make a difference. So if they're not getting adequate, that would be a problem, and it will affect, growth, and will affect carcass quality. And you definitely want animals, you always want animals to have access to water, but especially the week before slaughter. So I would think that, being deficient in salt might interact with that, and you'd want to have access to salt and access to water for a slaughter animal.
Okay. So another anonymous attendee, great presentation. How does a producer measure these traits to understand Siri probably to understand where the producer's herds stand at harvesting time, weight, etc., can be influenced by genetics? Is that a true statement?
Well, thank you. Yeah, so carcass traits are difficult to measure. If you retain ownership through the feedlot, which there's a lot of opportunities to do that, and I know Arizona producers that do that, retain ownership through the feedlot, and there's a very good chance you'll get back carcass traits, even on an individual animal, especially if you use electronic ID. You can get back individual animal carcass traits when they slaughter. And then you can feed that back into your herd by looking at which your cows and bulls, your higher quality or higher value carcasses come from. There's also, from a genetic selection standpoint, you might be better off using known, high accuracy EPDs that incorporate the genetic markers into them. Will probably give you a more rapid improvement than the time it'll take to get your own data back. But it would be great to get your own data.
Okay, and so this other question is kind of parallel universe, different angle. So how do ranchers know which breeds achieve the best marbling and muscle ratios? They'd have to receive feedback from slaughter after grading, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, as far as breed comparisons, there's there's a lot of data out there, and I put together that chart I showed you with the stars. You know, that didn't include all the breeds, obviously, but there's a lot of that breed average data out there. But there is a huge difference within breed, and I mean, marbling is pretty highly heritable, and muscling is one of the most heritable traits. So selection can have a big impact and has had a big impact. So you can really get a lot of differences in bulls, even within the same breed. Am I answering the question? How's the rancher know which breeds achieve the marbling muscling ratios?
I mean, I guess there's got to be some data on that from quote past, but also environmental feed sources and everything else, and would contribute to that as well, right?
Right. Yep. And certainly you got to pay attention to your environment and reproduction and fleshing ability and all that on your cows when you're selecting your breed. You don't want to just only pay attention to carcass, or you'll lose other things quick.
Okay. So we're coming close to our break time here. I've got the one question for missed what EPD stands for.
EPD is expected progeny difference. It's a genetic tool that gives a genetic value for an animal based not only on their own phenotype, but all the pedigrees of its ancestors and relatives.
Okay, and then we're going to get Garland practice putting this in the Q&A section, but is there a listing of the NHTC and all the natural outlets in Arizona?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's really a state thing. I mean, there's probably regional brands, but NHTC are primarily those cattle that are designated for, or a lot of them are designated for Europe, because Europe does not allow implants. So beef that we export to Europe has to be NHTC. And then the natural programs are all individual programs. I'm sure there's probably that online. You can find the natural beef programs that exist. There's quite a few of them.
Okay, so we've got a couple other questions that I believe that, Duane, you could probably type, and go ahead and type them public, not private, so that everyone can see the answer in there, because we are into our break and we've got Ashley Wright's going to lead us into the break.